Hey, good morning, friends. Today we're going to be talking about something that I don't think any of you have ever expected I would do a video on. Um, we're just going to rip the band-aid off. We're going to be talking about GAC today. GAC tends to be a game mode that I have minimally interacted with over the last 2 years, and I think within the community, a lot of people know that I am, or I used to be, what we would consider a GAC turtle, or a player that doesn't participate as actively in the game mode as other players might, right? I would set all of my GLs on defense and just do the best that I could, sitting in Kyber 2, sometimes Kyber 3 now, depending on how bad the squish is. Now, more recently, I have changed that, and I have been interacting a little bit more. I haven't finished my current match. I don't know if I'm going to win. I'll find out a little bit later today. That's not the purpose of what we're doing here. What we're going to be talking about is different things that we can do, or we can encourage Capital Games to do in order to fix the game, to fix the game mode, and to make it a little bit more exciting for the players. Now, a couple of things. Actually, let's switch the game off because we don't need this anymore. So let's turn that off. Let's throw these on. A couple of things that I want to kind of throw out there, because I know if you watch this whole video, people are going to say, oh, well, this and, well, that and this thing. There are a few things that I don't expect Capital Games to do. And primarily those things are, I don't expect 3v3 to ever go away. It's just not going to happen. I don't expect them to give players a choice between 3v3 and 5v5. I actually personally prefer 3v3 just because it's weird. I know that for a lot of theory crafting players, it's a nuisance. And that's why I enjoy it, is we see team compositions that sometimes are so out there and so out of the ordinary, that it makes the game interesting for me again. But I recognize, and I think that Capital Games recognizes, that if they were to give players a choice, that we would see the majority of players hitting 5v5 only. We're also not going to talk too much about GP gates. We are going to talk a little bit about it, but I don't expect CG to add the big bad GP gate that everybody wants for really super even matchmaking. I just don't think it's realistic. The idea in the game is that we are going to be put into matches sometimes that we don't want to be in, or matches that are where we're the underdog, or we're a little bit behind the player in front of us. And that's kind of like, that's what they want, right? They want players spending money. They want players feeling enticed to improve their rosters. And if every single match was this perfect even matchup, there would be no reason for players to do that. So, that's one thing that we will not be focusing on too much. The other thing is the squish. I don't know how it works. I just know that Kyber 1 slowly gets smaller and smaller. And Kyber 2 is now what Kyber 1 used to be, and a lot of Kyber 2 players are now playing in Kyber 3 and 4. I'm not privy to how big the squish is. I'm not privy to the information as to why they've chosen these things. I actually consider it to be a Capital Games economy issue, right? How many resources they want to allocate to players over time. And while I do recognize that those things can be an issue, I don't know how to fix them while also solving the problem from their end. Okay, but what I do know is that at the Gungies 2025, Grand Arena, as Game Mode of the Year, took up 51.4% of the player votes, right? So this is a game mode that players really resonate with. This is the game mode that excites players. This is the game mode that makes people want to continue playing the game. And while we did the Gungies for fun primarily, I think that this is an interesting thing for, CG to look at and say, I think we already knew this, but, now we have a better idea, at least from a cross section of the player base, right? So Gungies 2025. You're the inspiration for this video. So there are a couple of problems with GAC, and before we get a little bit further into that, I just want to say that I will be making a Reddit post on this with a much more in-depth text breakdown. So I'm going to try to be as in-depth as I possibly can in the video, and I think I'm going to explain myself relatively well for those of you that don't know how to read. But for those of you that come into the comments and go, oh, well, what about this thing and what about that thing? In the description, I will link the accompanying Reddit post, which will break down each of the individual aspects of this, maybe in a little bit of a better way if you're looking for a more complicated answer, right? So problem number one is our GAC ELO matchmaking, right? This is what we see right now. This is the system under which we get matches. I don't know the exacts of it. You don't know the exacts of it. All we know is that for the most part, GAC is broken down into 5 leagues. Okay, so we have carbonite, chromium, bronzium, iridium, and kyber. We know that our skill rating increases when we win. We know that our skill rating decreases when we lose. And for the most part, you get paired up with somebody that is either at the same rating as you, or is like plus or minus 1 rating of you. If you actually go into GAC and you go into your rankings, you'll see that the players that are immediately before and after you are the ones that you get matched up with. So for example, there is a player who 2 weeks ago let me know on Discord that I was in the same bracket as him. We didn't get to face each other. But in the next week, we were in the same bracket again. And I guess we also didn't get to face each other this week either. But I guess what ended up happening was that we won the same amount of matches. We went up and down the same amount. And we just happened to be in that same very, very specific cross section that we were in before. The problem with this is that while in Kyber, players aren't really affected, since 1 million GP, 2 million GP, they're hurdles that might not be insurmountable. At the very, very, very low end of the game, we can run into problems where players who maybe just stopped playing GAC for 6 months decide to start playing again, and we see players with 9 million GP going up against players with 3 million GP, and that can be really frustrating as a player who's brand new to the game, right? I've seen it on Reddit a lot where people say, hey, this is my first GAC, what the hell is this opponent? And that, when we talk about GAC ELO matchmaking, is the thing that we're going to be talking about the most, right? So we have a couple of solutions here, and I do intend for these solutions to work in tandem. So while you can use any one solution to help fix one thing, I think by using all of these solutions, we will get not only more fair matchmaking for the majority of players, but you'll get less frustration from the players who are most likely to quit. And the players who are most likely to quit are players who see this new game mode, they try it out, and they have a bad experience with it very early on. So the first thing we're going to talk about is creating a new league under Carbonite for new players only. And we're going to call that Chitin. just as a nod to Star Wars Galaxies. There was an armor set that you could get very early on in the game, chitin armor. You killed bugs and you got made chitin, and it was a whole thing. It was a great game. I could spend the next hour just talking about that. Some key points on chitin. This league will have the same rewards as Carbonite, and will only have a single division. Once players leave Carbonite, they will be unable to rejoin it. And players in chitin will need to win a certain number of rounds. We could say it's 5, we could say it's 10, before they're automatically placed in Carbonite. I think I maybe said Carbonite instead of chitin before, but you know, chitin, Carbonite, they're very similar. So they'll stay in chitin until they've won a certain amount of battles. And the purpose of this is it gives players who are newer to GC a safe space where they're learning how to play the game mode without having to be completely shit on by players who maybe just don't interact and they just suddenly pop back up into GAC after a long time. It gives those players a little bit of an opportunity to say, oh, actually, you know what, I do like this, before they're thrown immediately to the wolves, right? And again, the rewards will be the same as Carbonite, so there's no difference for these players or even to the economy of the game, and players will never go back into it ever once they have merged out of it or graduated out of it. The next thing that we're going to talk about is activity score, right? And what activity score basically is a score of how active you are in GAC. And we don't mean like you have to win every match, but this is going to be kind of a check against players who are 9 million going up against players who are 3 million in the lower leagues. Essentially, the game will try to pair you up based on your ELO matchmaking rating, but it's also going to try to match you up based on your activity score as well. The key points here are that players will be given an activity score of 1 through 10. All players will start at 5, which is what we see in the graphic here. Players will earn 1 activity point per GAC round, or 3, a maximum of 3 per week. Activity points will be earned by accomplishing 1 of 3 goals, and you'd only have to accomplish 1 of these goals in order to earn your activity rating. 1 is conducting attacks equal to the max defense divided by 2, rounded up, right? So if there are 4 teams on defense, you have to conduct 2 attacks in order to get your activity point. You don't have to win those battles, you just have to do 2 battles, right? And at the lower end, that's very small, that's super easy to do. Earning a score is max score possible divided by 4, right? So if the max score for a round is 400 points, you just have to earn 100 points and you'll get your activity point. Or just straight up winning the match. So if you only need to do 1 battle in order to win the match, that's fine. You got your activity point, you won, doesn't matter after that. Okay. If a player earns their activity point, they go up again, maximum of 10. If they don't earn their activity point, they go down a point, right, with a minimum of 1. Players during matchmaking will be matched up by their skill rating, with priority given to players with the same activity score. The matchmaking system will attempt to find a match within +1 activity score. So ideally the same, right? 5-5, 4-4. But at the end, it'll attempt to find a match within +1 activity score. If no match is found, it'll move on to +2 and so on and so forth. So only a very, 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 very small minutia of players will get into a position where they're at a +3 or a +4, right? We're talking about maybe 1 or 2 matches in the entirety of a week. Now, the one thing I want to make clear is that there is no real there's no real penalty for having a low activity score. That's not the purpose of this. The purpose of this is to prevent players who, they've stopped playing GAC for a year. They just let themselves drop down over a long period of time, and now they come back and they're beating up on new players. Okay, so the players in that position are more likely to be paired up against players who are in the same position. I come back to the game after a year, or I come back to the system after a year, I play up my match, I'm more likely to be paired up with a player who's in the same situation as I am. We might still see a GP disparity, but we're not going to be seeing heavily active newer players being paired up with veteran players. The final thing that I want to talk about with this specific issue is what we're going to call reductive GP gates. Okay. And basically what this means is as we move up in leagues, the gate will become increasingly bigger and bigger and bigger until we get to Kyber and there will be no GC gate. Now on the screen, you're going to see some percentages, and basically what this means is that in Carbonite, the system will try very, very hard to get you within 10% GP of the player you're playing against. By the time you move to Erodium, that GP gate is going to be about 40%, right? So you are still going to see heavy GP swings, possibly, depending on activity score, depending on ELO matchmaking rating. But at the lower end of the game, those GP gates are going to be much more nurturing to the player. And then by the time you get into Kyber, where there is no more GP gate locked in, you could, as a 6 million player, be facing off against player with 12 million, and that's just how the system is designed to work. Again, I don't think that CG is going to introduce GP gates overall, but I do think that this is a very nice way of allowing players who are newer, less veteran, to become acclimated to the game without having to worry about the craziness that is what is currently GAC matchmaking range. So if we employ all of these three systems in the game, what I think that this will do is, one, it'll have a very minor impact on the late game, right? We won't really see much change if you're a Kyber player. However, we will see far more fairer matchups in the lower ring leagues. We also aren't going to see what we're calling sticker shock for players new to GAC. So players booting up GAC for the first time, and then bam, they're in unwinnable matches that make the game unfun for them. And hopefully this helps the game to grow even more than it has been over the last year or two. Right? So again, we could take any one of these things and I think it would help, but all three of those systems in place together would be designed to, keep it more interesting and fair for everybody below Kyber. Now, the second problem is what I am in long form calling time zones, work schedules, and the art of waiting. And basically what that means is that GAC runs on a 24-hour clock that does not take into account the local time of the player. And this makes sense because it is a global game and the game is not going to just try to pair up players who have very similar timelines, but this can be heavily frustrating for players where GAC starts at like 4 in the morning, who are playing against players where GAC starts and ends at a very favorable time for those players, right? So myself, I I am in Eastern Standard Time. GAC starts at about 5 to 6 p.m. for me, depending on, not global warming, holy shit, depending on the time change. We're just going to call it the time change because it's 6 in the morning and I can't think of it. And it's very easy for me to wait, or people in my time zone, I should say, because I work 2 jobs. It's very easy for people in my time zone to wait until the last minute to do GAC, but it's very hard for players on the other side of the world where GAC is falling, again, at like 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, during the very specific workday, right? Like 1 p.m. during their workday. This can be really frustrating because there is a fundamental advantage to players who are able to wait. Now, I know that there is a counter argument to this where some players have said, well, if you go first and you have a really good round, then psychologically your opponent is gonna get really frustrated and they're gonna make mistakes and they're gonna lose. My counter argument to that is that if you go first and you have an amazing round and it psychologically screws with your opponent into making mistakes, your opponent was going to lose anyway. They were going to play a safe round. They were going to have a lower score overall. And they were going to lose. I do not believe that there is any situation realistically where having more information about the game mode is better, or worse, I should say, than having less information, right? So I do see this as a problem in GAC, and as much as I benefit from it, okay, I generally do my GACs fairly early just because that's the time that I have. But as much as I benefit when players do attack before me and I can look and say, I'm not doing this round now because I can save time, I know I've lost, I do recognize that when it comes to competitive GAC, this can be a frustration for a lot of players. And what we're going to talk about here is Fog of War. Now, Fog of War is something, for those of you who are not familiar, that originates with real-time strategy games. And the mechanic basically in those games would hide portions of the map from players if they didn't have units in that particular section of the map. Now, if I were sent over to the other side of the map and I saw my opponent's base, I would still always see their base no matter what. I know that there were buildings there, but I wouldn't know if it changed unless I sent new units there. So for our purposes, Fog of War is a way of not seeing what's going on our opponent's screen before the end of the match, right? And you'd always be able to review and check out your match afterwards. And there's 3 ways that we can play Fog of War. We'll talk about all 3 of those ways, right? So a light Fog of War is basically that you won't see your opponent's score until the review phase. You will see that they have done attacks. You will see that they've taken out territories. You will see how many battles that it took them, but you will not see their score. And in light Fog of War, you'll have a pretty good idea of the scoring, right? But because of undermans and because of teams that steal banners, you wouldn't have a full picture. You would just be able to say, oh, hey, you know what? I see that they attacked everything. There's no way I can do that. I'm going to log off. In a medium Fog of War, you will see cleared teams and territories, but you will not see battle count, or opponent's score. So just like in a light Fog of War, I would see if they full cleared me. I would not see a score, and I'd have no idea how many battles that it took, right? So I can look at it and I'd go, well, this could be a 1500, this could be an 1800, I have no idea. Let's go in and do our best. And then finally, in a heavy Fog of War, you'll see no information. You won't see that they have attacked. You won't see their score. You'll see literally nothing other than the fact that your opponent exists. and your own defense. It won't be until the review phase that you can go back and say, oh, hey, this is what they did. This is how many battles it took. But otherwise, it would not affect your review. It would not affect what you can see on .gg the next day after the week is over. You just would have to go into the battle blind, which would allow players to more freely do GAC at a time that is more convenient to them, rather than trying to wait for the last 45 minutes of GAC. So what does this fix? It's going to allow players to do battles at any time or any time throughout the day. I do actually think that this is going to make GAC a little bit more interesting, especially if we go with a heavy fog of war, because players will have to be more aggressive. And they will have to make those decisions without knowing what decisions their opponent makes. So I do think you'll overall see less full clears as players try to beat teams with 4-mans or 3-mans that might be more risky to them than always going in with the most reliable 5-mans. I also think that this is going to make ties a lot less likely, just because there are situations that come up where a player says, hey, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to win this match, but I do know I have more GP than my opponent, so as long as I get that tying score, it's a win for me. Because we won't have that information, I do think that you'll see more score disparities between players. Which actually leads into problem 3, which is essentially, why does the bigger account win the tie? And for those of you on Reddit, you know I have this very specific copy pasta that I employ often when people talk about this. And what it essentially boils down to is that in the old GAC system, it obviously was still the same. Players were basically actively encouraged not to increase their roster because matchmaking worked on your effective GP. And we're not going to get too far into what effective GP is, but it essentially meant that players did not build up the back end of their roster, which kind of affected territory battles, and it of course affects the bottom line of the company because now they can't sell you packs for lower end things. The new system of GAC with the ELO matchmaking is much better. It allows people to do that, and if we allow the lower GP target to always win, we're going to kind of go back to that same old setting of people being very miserly with their accounts, right? Which is not really what we want. So what I've designed here is actually a 3-tiered system for ties. And the first 2 tiers here are very similar, but bear with me here, right? Because remember, we're not always talking about full clears. So the first thing the system would check in a multi-tier tiebreaker is most teams cleared, right? Whoever cleared the most battles, they end up being the winner. And while obviously that does seem like a, hey, wait a second, Egnards, that's always going to be the case. And that's not true. If you have a very inefficient run, a player who has taken up less ground can actually tie or beat you. But now in this system, the system would first check and say, hey, this person won 10 battles, this person won 9 battles. The person who won 10 battles ended up clearing more ground, even if it was less efficiently, they're gonna win. Now, if that happens to be a tie, the system is going to check least overall battles. And that actually seems like the same thing, but there are going to be situations where this isn't the case. So for example, I believe it's on the 3rd match where you're always going to basically get the same score. After you've lost the first match and the first win bonus, after the second match, I think it's always like 15 to 20 banners at that point. So you can feasibly throw shit against the wall after the second match and have it not affect your your banner count any more than 2 battles. So in this situation where we have 2 teams, 2 players who have cleared the same number of battles, the system is going to check to see if one threw shit out against the wall, and if one did not, right? So if a player ended up doing 20 battles and another player ended up doing 15 battles, that player who ended up doing 15 battles is going to end up being the winner. Now, the important thing to note here is that the system is only going to check for successful battles, or for successful nodes, right? So if you throw shit against the wall against a team that you literally just could not beat, the system is not going to count those battles. It's only going to count battles against teams that were successfully completed. I feel like doing it the other way is going to put players in a position to not try, and that's not necessarily something that we want to do here. If there is still a tie, then at that point it will go to the player with the higher GP. So when I say what this should fix, I actually think that Fog of War itself is going to limit the number of ties that we see. But essentially what we're hoping to fix here is to reduce the likelihood that GP comes into play with ties. And I do think that between Fog of War and this multi-tiered system, that we will see a very, very significant change in the number of ties that the system allows every GAC week or GAC season, and that is a positive for players, especially for players who do not understand the system, because again, we want to reduce frustration points without reducing the bottom line, because CG is a company. They do want to make money. Now, the next thing is going to be something that I think no player would ever expect me to say, but I do agree that at this point it kind of needs to happen. We're only going to talk about it from a 5v5 position, but comparable changes would also happen in 3v3. Essentially, what we're talking about is the current GAC layout. Oh, look at that. The current GAC layout, and the idea that the GAC layout does need to expand in Kyber, right? Nowhere else, just Kyber. We have so many super teams in the game right now and so many counters in the game right now that players are throwing the most insane things on defense, knowing they will still be able to full clear. And it has gotten so stale at the top where you know you're going to be fighting the same exact wall, the same exact way every single time. Right now with the current Datacron's third sister, always on defense, Grand Inquisitor Datacron, right? And I'm going to throw Treya at it every single time with Savage, and I'm going to beat it 95 out of 100 times. We know that 95% of the time you're going to see Rey with Ben and Hezra, as long as somebody doesn't already have Ahsoka. We know that we're going to see Quad May on defense. You might see it with Grandmaster Yoda. You might not see it with Grandmaster Yoda, but predominantly players are going to throw Bane at it. It's the same shit every single time. It's not interesting. It's not fun anymore. I do think that expanding the board is going to primarily help GAC slightly, to allow players to participate more freely, and thin out the rosters at the top end. And we're also going to talk about how we're going to change the time dynamic of players too. So hold in until the end. Look at that. I knew I switched around my slides. So let's just pretend that I said this one, and then we went back to that one. It's early in the morning. It's fine. So what will that Playfield expansion look like? We're going to introduce a middle back wall. Okay, and that middle back wall in Kyber 4 and 5 will just have a single team placed there. In Kyber 2 and 3, there'll be 2 teams placed there, and in Kyber 1, there will be 3 teams placed there. So we'll see a maximum of 3 teams overall in that middle back wall. And beating that middle back wall, I know that there's no arrows in my graphic here, will either happen by attacking both front walls to open up the middle, or by attacking either front wall and its adjoined back wall. Okay, I know I can't like move around on my screen and show this to you, but if you were to beat the top wall and the fleet wall, you could sneak behind to beat that third wall. Or you could choose to beat both of the top walls and brute force right into that middle wall. Either way would work for the system. I do think it's necessary. I do think it will help. I do think it'll thin out teams, and it'll make Kyber 1 and the higher Kybers a little bit more interesting. One thing that I do want to point out with this, though, is I do understand that there is going to be an increased time dynamic. So what I do think should also happen, thinking, of course, about the CG economy and the expectation of what they will or won't give us, is right now we get a random box that is sent to us with each win, and that random box has 100,000 credits in it. What CG should do here is add a second random box to each win, and that second random drop box will drop a random amount of GAC currency. All right, let's say from, I don't know, 10 to 500, which is a lot. But the expected value would be 35. So you might get 500, but over the course of time, over the course of a match, over the course of a season, over the course of a year, your expected value would be 35 per win, which would be roughly ish around 500 to 600 currency per match, which is not that egregious. It's 1 to 2 purchases per full clear match, right? Not that bad at all. Anyway, the final thing that I want to talk about is GAC quality of life. And I want you to bear with me as I explain both of these things that we're going to talk about. But these are things that would not fundamentally alter GAC that much, but it would be better and beneficial to the players, more interesting to them, easier access for them. Right? So the first thing we're going to talk about is allowing more saved defenses. I am a hot utils user, so I can go into hot utils, I can save a form defense, and then I can play with my GAC defense and say, you know what, this works really perfectly. For players who are not hot utils users, and keep in mind that CG does not make any money from hot utils, it becomes very difficult for them to want to change their defense around, because you either have to trust in the fact that you're deleting everything first, or you have to do it one team at a time, which is its own pain in the ass of going one team in and then going, oh wait, I have to delete this other team and switch it over here and move it around over there. It puts players in a position where they may be afraid to change their defenses. I do think that players should at the very least be able to save 2 defensive layouts, right? Instead of just 1 defensive layout. It gives them 1 layout that they can say, this is my safe layout, and 1 layout where they can play with it. And they can say, all right, I want to try with some new things and see how these new things work and not be afraid of screwing up my old defense that I typically use. I think it will give players more agency to be able to make changes in a safer environment. The second change, and this one's going to be divisive, is to be allowed to quit and save a battle at any time. Now, in the past, I understood why you couldn't do this, right? It's because then I can set turn meters the way I want for setting up counters or 2 shots that I know that I need. But ever since CG changed the whole forfeit and submit thing that we've had in the past, where if you lose, I feel like we have been in a position to see this happen. And essentially what this allows players to do, I'll use an example from my own GAC experience as a former turtle. If I were to see Jabba on defense, I would throw my Night Sisters at them. I would never expect my Night Sisters to win, and I know they can sometimes, depending on very specific circumstances. Mine have won sometimes. But my goal was always a 2-shot. And I would send in my team and I would get it down to Jabba only. And then what happens, I have to literally just sit there for 3.5 minutes and wait for the timer to run out. Because I know the team's not going to win, right? I know that it's not set up in a certain way. And I just have to sit there and watch the clock. And that actually is more dangerous nowadays, because if you lose a battle, but you don't hit submit or forfeit in time, the game automatically forfeits for you instead of submits it, which I have been screwed over by in the past. What this will allow players to do when they know that they're setting up a 2-shot is to set up their 2-shot and get out and have less time wasted. The one caveat to this is that this would only work on your own turn. So if I set up something and the enemy goes into an endless turn meter loop, yes, you would have to stop and watch that. You could still hit the submit button, the exit submit button, but the game would not register it until it is your turn for your turn where one of your team can take an action, right? So if you have 2 guys left and one of them's stunned and it's his turn, he doesn't get to get his action, you would still have to wait until the game set back on you, to prevent being able to throw in the absolute lowest thing and control turn meters exactly as needed, but to still allow you to emulate the idea of, instead of waiting 3 minutes and watching your phone, being able to just skip that process entirely. Okay, so with all of that said, once again, this will be posted on Reddit if you want the text breakdown as well. I would love to hear your thoughts. I would love to hear your comments. I would love to hear what you think, if you feel like there are changes to the system as I put it out there. I do think that these are overly positive, without destroying the system that CG has put into place for us, for the reasons that they put that system into place. So I will leave the Reddit link as well in the show notes if you are interested in seeing those. Share this around. Let me know. I really am interested in feedback from the player base. But with all of that said, have a great rest of your day, and peace out.